Hello, Internet. My name is Ryan Sesney. I am the director of the gaming track for JordanCon this year, and I'm here with a very special guest. Eric, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Well, sure. Thanks, Ryan, for having me. And hello to Jordan Kahn and everybody watching out there. Very special. That's kind. My name's Erik Jensen. I'm a longtime DM, Dungeons and Dragons aficionado, old school Renaissance blogger, occasional con runner, and as of a few months ago, zine publisher.
Nice. What is it now? I know that you are quite preferring the OSR scene compared to a lot more modern takes on it. What what can you tell me about the old school Renaissance?
Oh wow, the old school Renaissance is a movement or community or concept that basically means two things. One, that vintage role playing games have value, they're worth playing. And then, as a corollary to that, it's worthwhile and exciting to create new content for those games and to share that content. So it's just that simple. It's not just about playing the old games and keeping them alive, or scratching the nostalgia itch, or even doing the historical research to see how games were played back in the day. It's about really keeping them alive and understanding the classic play styles for what they were.
I hear you. And let me ask you this: where would you draw the line as far as like a old school Renaissance game versus something like, for instance, the latest iteration of the Mystara Player's Handbook, which is a translation of the old Beckme sitting into fifth edition?
So I think in general, a lot of people agree that old school, stops at a certain point. We can argue about where that is. Some people like when it comes to D&D, some people like to use the TSR Wizards Divide uh, as a line there. I think really it is more about play style than the age of the product. There are assumptions made in a lot of newer games, including newer editions of Dungeons and Dragons, about the power levels of the game or the nature of the player characters relative to the world around them. And so, as those assumptions start to slide, you see the older school turning more into the new school. But I'm not sure there's a bright line divide.
What is it? I will say that offhandedly, that is a big thing that I notice with most OSR artwork specifically. That comes through the most. More modern editions of Fifth and the like usually have very epic, very high power heroes, basically, punching a giant or something like that, and it's really doing something. Versus the older school ones, characters are usually running from the giant.
Right, right. And that comes down to both the assumed power levels of the characters in the setting, but also the kind of fictional genre you're trying to emulate. If you're trying to do big darn heroes, right, who are constantly saving the world or are in the middle of some epic trilogy to stop the big bad evil guy, well, then maybe a new school game is going to make assumptions that promote that playstyle. But if you're looking for more of a sword and sorcery, uh, hard Scrabble, almost grimdark look at things, where lethality happens, nobody has plot armor, then you're going to want to look at more of an old school implementation of the game.
Well, and the term kind of grimdark gets thrown out a lot too, although there's a direct reference to Warhammer with that,
Sure.
obviously, because that's their tagline for their marketing. But where would you put that as far as a an OSR game versus more new ones?
Well, it's funny. I don't really run games that I would call grimdark, but often an older school game is going to be more realistic in certain ways. And realism is kind of a curse word when it comes to role playing games, right? Especially fantasy ones. But in terms of the things that player characters can do, uh, older school characters tend to be more grounded, right? They're not automatically doing heroic things. You know, any game in which you can accidentally slip down the stairs and kill your character, that's probably not a new school game. But it doesn't have to be grim and dark. But As far as things that interface with lethality assumptions, I mean, in an older school game, poison is something that can be used by anybody, and it's a great equalizer, right? You fail a saving throw versus poison, and you lose your character. Uh, in a more modern game like Fifth Edition, that's not the case. Poison is just a kind of damage, or it adds a condition, or it knocks you out of play temporarily. So survivability is one measuring stick for the old schoolness of a game. It's not the only one. I think actually more important than that is the tone set by assumptions of player agency. And what I mean by that is that, in a new school game, I hesitate to say that they're automatically on a rail. They're not, but it's more about interacting with the fictional narrative and less about building a world.
What is it? It's been my experience, at least with earlier editions of fantasy games, that you could die in a dungeon because you failed to save and got cut by a rusty blade, and you survived the blade, but ooh, there's tetanus. That's
Right.
a very grounded way to look at your fantasy versus fifth edition. I think rules is written tetanus is a little bit of damage for like 3 rounds, which if you survive, you're you're golden.
Right. And half of the people in your party can use healing anyway, so it's not a big deal. But beyond that, it's about scope. So in an old school game, the game is, or let me use the word campaign. The campaign is the game world, and it chugs on regardless of whether you succeed or fail, and even if your PC dies. At some point between 1974 and today, the way we use the word campaign shifted, and it started to mean, hey, this is the series of adventures I'm playing with these same 5 players, right? And whatever happens, and it comes to a point and then it stops. Yay, the campaign's done. Old school doesn't really work that way. The campaign is the world, right? It's Greyhawk, it's whatever the name of your campaign world is, and it keeps going. People run the same games for years, and people come and people go as players. So in a way, it's about the size of the player characters, not just in the fiction, right? Because they're expendable or they can die pretty easy. But as far as the impact they have on the game world writ large.
Just to kind of like tie this back to more modern games, as it were. I had read your blog, and you talk a lot about various fifth edition modules and supplements in there. How would you, well, I should say, how do you basically old schoolize them?
Sure. I mean, we're not starved for content. There's a lot out there from a bunch of different game systems, different editions, different setting assumptions. And I think an active GM is going to cannibalize from anything they can get their hands on, right? If it inspires, if it's worth stealing from, you're going to steal from it. And then on top of that, right now, fifth edition is very, very popular, and you have a lot of people coming into the hobby via fifth edition. And so there's a lot of clamor to play that edition. So when I run fifth edition, my current Friday night game is 5e. I wouldn't say that I do a lot mechanically to old schoolize it. There are some people that change the way death saves work to make the game more lethal, or they change the default healing rate in the game so that healing is more scarce like it was in older versions of the game. I haven't really worried about that. With my current group, I'm focused on trying to get them to drive the action. The old school playstyle favors player-driven action in the sense that I don't want players who show up on Friday night and say, okay, Eric, what are we doing tonight? I want players who've been scheming the last 2 weeks and roll in and tell me what they're doing tonight.
Hmm.
I'm here presenting a world, representing a world. They have, you can lay out adventure hooks, bits and bobs for them to go after. The middle ground is like the menu approach. And a lot of people start campaigns this way, regardless of whether it's old school or no school. Like, hey, there's 3 things you can do. What do you want to do this session? Or next session if you need the planning time. But I'm totally fine with seat of the pants or having them go around to look at things that have already been seeded. And I want them to drive it. I want organic character growth, where the characters are reacting to things they have encountered within the campaign, rather than waiting to be reactive and have the next chapter placed in front of them.
And would you consider this, I've heard it called the free marches style approach, be applied to all old school games, or do you think that's more or less?
So there's two things going on there. There's West Marches, and then there's the open table concept. And I don't think everybody runs their old school games that way, but those concepts, especially when used together, definitely will move any game, whether it's a modern 5e game or an old school D&D game or Traveler or Firefly or whatever you're playing. It'll move it in an old school direction. So the West Marches concept is, like I was implying, player driven action, right? No set schedule for the game, which can be very difficult for people to implement. But the important thing is that the players come together and say to the DM, hey, next time we play, the five of us are getting together and we're going over to such and such mountain because we're going to chase this rumor, right? So player driven action in kind of an open wilderness setting. The corollary to that is an open table, which means anybody can play, drop in, drop out play. So, a lot of people who came into gaming more recently, or even who came in back when I did in the early 80s, have spent most of their gaming career playing with the same people or with a study group. And you find yourself faced with this quandary where you get to the point where you say, well, only 3 people are here tonight. Should we even play? Let's do something else instead. And so, like I was saying earlier, at that point, the campaign becomes about that circle of friends and not about the world moving forward. So in an open table, you've got drop in, drop out. Whoever shows up, and those PCs decide what they're going to do next. And so with that, you also have that old school concept in a leveled system like Dungeons and Dragons, where not everybody's going to be at the same power level all the time because it depends on how often you showed up.
And at least with the writing of most of the official modules, the assumption is with most D&D is that you're going to be playing with the same group and you're more or less going to be leveling at the same time, although that's very much not the assumption with a lot of OSR games. In fact, a lot of the classes for various systems just don't level at the same time. A thief basically would level faster than a fighter.
Right. Right. And so when you look at the covers of old D&D modules and you see there's a level range on there, right? They say for levels 5 through 8 or whatever. And as you say, everybody's moving at a slightly different rate because you've got different tables. Once we hit 3rd edition, which is the first Wizards of the Coast version of the game, and they unify experience progression, then those assumptions start to come along, right? They build a game that's about an expectation of experience, a consistent experience. So then the modules start to look that way. And actually, I'm showing my age calling them modules, right? The published adventures start to look that way. They make an assumption that you have a balanced party, whatever that means for your edition, of, let's say, 4 PCs, which is what they presume in 5e, who are all the same level. And prior versions of the game absolutely did not assume that. We got in that habit, but that was not the presumption of the game originally.
It kind of draws my mind back to a lot of the old Mystara modules. I mean, a lot of them like highly favored one class. For instance, the series that dealt with the Master. If you didn't have a party that was heavy with either thieves or halflings or some kind of like sneaky class, you were going to die a lot in the first module.
It's funny you mentioned that. Is X4 and X5, which are Master of the Desert Nomads and Temple of Death. I'm actually prepping those for 5e to run those with my Friday night group later this year. And you're right, it's heavily stealth based. Although I think in most old school games, there was an assumption that you would have to sneak and run and try things a second time with whoever survived. The concept that everything that we're approaching is a level appropriate challenge, right? Everything's going to be a little hard till we get to the big guy, and then that'll be a lot hard. That actually promotes a kind of kick in the door play style that's actually more combat based and hack and slashy than old school ever was.
Mm. Oh no, I remember back when I went through it the first time, what is it? We did not do well on the first combat, and then we were just running the rest of that module. And it worked in so far as like it allowed us to go through and basically still continue the storyline, and we made it through the module without having to like there wasn't actually a fight we had to win. And that was like, I remember that as being like a really strong point of that module because it
Hmm.
felt very much like, Empire Strikes Back to
Yeah,
where
that's a weird one. I mean, that pair of adventures is really about infiltration and intel gathering. You don't actually have to confront the big bad evil guy in that one, and maybe you're better off not doing it.
it would definitely help you live longer. But
Right.
getting back to what you had said earlier, though, I know that the OSR tends to like zines and modular publications. I mean, there are even like a couple of zines that have like entire settings, basically kind of released a little bit at a time,
Hmm.
anywhere from 30-page publications to, big old, 60-page behemoths as far as zines go. Is this more or less a issue of that is a desired size and scale for this sort of product, or is it more that a lot of creators such as yourself basically are kind of testing the waters to see if it's more interested or if there's enough interest to like basically do an edition 2 or 3?
I think a lot of it's happy coincidence. I mean, the OSR is kind of tightly lashed up with the DIY mindset, right? So not only are you encouraged as a hobbyist to create your own campaign world and run your own games rather than run somebody else's stuff, you're encouraged to look back at the way the hobby grew. And in the early days, uh, zines and newsletters and things like that were part of the hobby, right? It's pre-internet. We didn't necessarily have a corner game club or a game store with public play. Maybe we got our stuff off the rack at Walden Books, right? So those sections in the back of Dragon Magazine that helped you find other gamers and find cons were kind of important. So the zine scene came up around the same time, music mostly, but the fashion for zines in RPGs, I think it hasn't hit everybody. It's, I think it is a fashion. When the OSR first started getting rolling and people were using retro cloned versions of classic rules in order to put out new adventures, kind of that first generation of it was really going for mimicry. When you look at the early OSR adventure modules, they deliberately ape the TSR style, both in form factor and size, font, and then the way the covers look, right? Because they're trying to scratch that nostalgia itch and communicate what the product is about. At some point, the artsier side of the OSR, and there's definitely kind of an art punk vibe to one corner of it, really got into zines. And it makes sense because a zine can be published pretty easily without a lot of fuss, depending on how low tech you want to take it. It can be distributed person to person or, produced as a PDF. And it's the way to test the waters, like you imply. Uh, but I think it's also kind of fun to get into it. You see all your peers sharing their house rules or whatever in a zine, and you say that's a pretty low bar. I can do that. It's the physical equivalent of a podcasting app like Anchor or something like that, where it makes it very easy for somebody to try it, and it doesn't stick with everybody, but they get into it. That form factor too, the smaller A5 size. Um, Folded in half type size. I think there are folks in the gaming circles who like the smaller books just for backpack purposes, I guess. But of course, like anything else, it becomes addictive. Once you have a handful of zines, well, then you're going to have a whole shelf the same size, right? So you keep kind of collecting them. But the serial zines are pretty interesting. As you mentioned, you have people that will put out one, and if it sells through, then they do the second version or the second volume, I should say, that kind of extends what they're talking about, whether it's a setting or a theme or a series of adventures.
Yes, and I'm specifically thinking of Black Pudding and Wormskin.
Oh,
Basic,
sure, from James West, sure. Hmm.
yeah. They've both been fairly. They had a full run. They were so successful that they have been basically published in a secondary format, basically for all of them, like all in one book.
Right, right. And so that makes sense, right? If you start small and then you get 4 or 5 issues in and find out that there's demand for it, then you can bind them all together. Um, and some folks would go through and reorder the stuff or add things. It all depends on what folks think is going to sell. There is a little bit of controversy, within the old school or OSR, whatever you want to call it, about monetization of your home game. It became very fashionable for a time to say, all right, all the free stuff I used to put on a blog, I'm now going to put in a zine or in a book. And there was a little bit of controversy about that. Is that true to the sharing blogging spirit or whatever? But, these days it's so easy to publish, and a lot of people are doing a mixture of stuff for pay and stuff for free that's still out there. I don't think it's a major concern, but it's neat to see people get into trying new things. And that's kind of the point of the hobby, right? I mean, when role-playing games first started out, there wasn't anything like them. So that spirit of discovery, that spirit of trying something new, I think it's historical. It permeates the hobby.
Yes, and I will comment briefly. Just the economic side of this. It's a thing that kind of is pervasive in all forms of literature. It seems like, because especially when like fan magazines were taking off in the 1920s. They didn't look at like horror and science fiction as like a valid genre, so the authors were encouraged to basically darn near give away their stories for like $1, basically, just for the honor of being published. I think that's a very organic way that these sorts of media basically permeate, because you start off with essentially the first generation. They have to kind of like prove themselves, and then from that, you get into people who start making a business out of it. And I just think that that's kind of where like a lot of this stuff starts. I don't know.
As easy as it is to make a PDF now and to distribute it, I think a lot of people have woken up to the idea that the dream we all had in high school of someday I'm going to write role-playing games and work in the industry, the way to do that is not to waste 10 years of your life sending samples to Wizards of the Coast and hope that they bless you. Right? The way to do that is to get your brand out there, write your stuff, and just grow your brand. It's just like being an indie science fiction author, right? You've decided, I'm not going to let a corporate gatekeeper hold me back from my dreams. I'll start smaller, right? And I will grind and get bigger as time goes on.
Shifting this a little bit, I noticed that a lot of the more, I don't want to say more older, because this is not necessarily true of all of them, but some of the more famous and established ones, such as Dragon and White Dwarf, although they did have a common theme that they went through, basically you could get a lot of like stuff about like a series on dragon ecology or something like that in Dungeons and Dragons with Dragon magazine, and they had like series that ran several episodes, or that was very in line with a series. But there was a lot of eclectic stuff. It was very much like most magazines. You'd turn to one page, you'd get like a section on dragon ecology. You turn 3 pages later, you're dealing with somebody's suggestions for like dwarven ales and a tasting guide, and pricing and things like that for taverns. And modern OSR zines tend to be a little bit more focused than that.
Oh, absolutely.
A few exceptions. Do you think do you think that's more or less a issue of being more directed and a single person having more creative control, or do you think that's more in line with the fact that they were just trying to fill content back in the day?
Yeah, it's both those. I mean, when you look at a commercial magazine like Dragon or Imagine or White Dwarf or Arcane or whatever, that's a full magazine that has to be out every month on schedule, come hell or high water. And so, of course, they have to get multiple authors and a bunch of different artists. That's the way magazines work. And they have a lot more overhead, right? With a zine or self-published stuff, even if you're looking at authors who regularly crank out new adventures on the DM's Guild, right, as part of that program, they're putting out a new PDF adventure every month. It's less content, so you can be a little more finicky about how you do it. And that lends itself towards this sort of auteur single voice concept. So like you said, you flip through Dragon and here's something about dragons, and then here's an article about dwarven ales. Well, maybe somebody took all their blog posts about dwarven ales and put it into a zine. and I see that, and then that's what I get. Um, the As far as page count goes, if you took any 6 or 7 random zines and stacked them together to match the page count or the column width of a classic issue of Dragon, it's going to look more like a mixed magazine, right? You're going to have different topics. Maybe there's an adventure in there. So it's just it's comparable to, say, network TV back in the day when you only have a couple choices and you watch whatever's on by reading Dragon, or today when you've got the internet and streaming, and you can really sort of neck down your choices and find that niche, find that thing you want to read about, but also use recommendations to discover things you never would have thought to read.
The a la carte style is a very OSR thing too. So what is it?
Yeah, it's customization, right? You want to make it your own.
Yeah. What is it? Speaking of zines, what is it? You had mentioned this in your introduction, but I did want to highlight this. You, sir, have just put out one by the name of Lumberlands, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. We did Lumberlands last year for Zine Quest 2 with Kickstarter. Every year for the past several years, Kickstarter has done a big promotion thing to try and get on the zine bandwagon. And it's actually been really useful for folks as a joint marketing kind of thing. So yeah, Lumberlands, it's related to my long running campaign and blog, but I wanted to do something new. So I challenged myself. You know, when you write, you want constraints sometimes because they'll force you to finish. So I said, okay, a zine doesn't have to be that big. I will limit my content and I'll write all new content, right? So rather than recycle stuff from the blog or update it, I picked a chunk from my campaign world that had been on the map, but nobody had ever actually gone there. So there were very few details. And I said, all right, I'm going to outline this and write it and see where it goes from there. And we've been very lucky. It was funded, very minimal goal. And then I was approached by Paolo Greco, who runs the Lost Pages Press over in the UK. He said, hey, you want any help with this? And I said, Lord, yes, I need help with this for the layout and distribution and stuff. So we partnered up on it, and we found a great artist in Alex Damasceno, and I'm super excited. We just finished fulfillment in print after some pandemic-related delays, as you might imagine. But I'm pretty excited to put it up in print on demand very soon, so everybody will be able to check it out.
Yes, and what is it? I did see the Kickstarter, but I saw it after it had already been funded. So on a personal note, I am looking forward to reading through it.
Well, I'll send you one. I hope it's fun. I mean, you want these things to be fun to read, but actually useful at the table too, right? When you look at gaming products, sometimes we're forced to make a choice between something that I can use at the table because it's full of things to riff off of improv-wise and random tables and things like that, or it's a well-scripted adventure, or things that are just inspirational, setting stuff, lore, things like that. I hope I threaded the needle with Lumberlands. It's meant to be a mini setting that you can drop in to any D&D campaign. I say D&D, but there really aren't any stats in the book. It's system agnostic. So I guess you could reskin the whole thing as a backwater planet or something if you wanted to use it in a different kind of game. But the gimmick is that it's a vast wilderness of woods, not unlike the Pacific Northwest. And there are factions of lumberjacks and Sasquatches in conflict. And that's the whole shtick.
I feel like you're somewhat avoiding one of the highlights of it too, as there's a very prominent picture of a squirrel in full plate mail.
Oh yeah, well there are squirrels as well, right? So the third major faction is a hidden city of squirrels up in the treetops that's left for players to discover and track down via rumor and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a book that'll be fun for folks who are willing to take their fantasy gaming a little less seriously. That's just the tone that I write in. I learned years ago that if I try to write a very serious adventure, I can't. It's just not the way I'm wired. So yeah, this is Lumberjacks and Squirrels. I hope that it's written in such a way that it's useful at the table and for running in an improv kind of way, so that any GM could take it and say, all right, I know that my PCs are going to traverse the Lumberlands for the next couple sessions, and there's just enough stuff in here for me to handle that. You've got factions, you've got a starting town, some situations, a bunch of NPCs, a bunch of encounters, and adventure hooks pretty much on every page. But there's no map, right? It's not about come and play my Lumberlands. It's about it being a toolkit to let you build your own Lumberlands.
Well, and those are usually the sorts of supplements that you can get the most use out of. So
I
I
hope
do
so.
appreciate that. Uh, I do like them. I do like really pretty maps, and basically having like, especially if it's an established campaign setting like the Forgotten Realms that you have novels and such over, like having, those really nice maps up on your wall, really, they look good, but they're usually not practical, in play unless you're doing a very specific like hex crawling game.
Right, right. I did consider when I was putting this together making it into a more coalesced hex crawl, but then I kind of decided that given that most of the terrain was going to look pretty similar, I mean, the whole point is that it's all woods, right?
Mm.
I didn't think that the constraints created by a formal hex crawl would pay off relative to just leaving it a little more madcap. Um, and, really, that's all you need, right? You've got a town on one edge, whatever edge is convenient, the company town where the lumber company is, and it's your proper western town with saloons and stuff, and then a giant wooded area to poke around in. And if somebody takes it and they want to use a hex map and do it that way, they can populate that hex map with the adventure with the encounter tables that are in the book.
It's an interesting idea, and I really like this because I feel like it's somewhat left out of a lot of current D&D products, that travel is really kind of the goal of this module. It's not really, how can I phrase it? It's not a means to an end. You're exploring the area, you're dealing with Sasquatch, and that essentially puts the overland travel as kind of the high point of it. In a lot of like modern fifth edition modules and campaign settings, it's the the travel's the necessary evil. You're trying to get
Right.
to the temple of elemental evil to like deal with the thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I can't tell you how many podcasts or articles I read after Tomb of Annihilation came out. I don't know if you're familiar with that adventure, with people lamenting, I liked it, but I didn't like the hex crawl through the jungle. Well, to me, the exploration of the jungle is kind of the point of the adventure. So when we look at something like Lumberlands, if you want to use it in a more linear fashion and say, we're going to start in this town and I want them to go here, here, and here on a fetch quest or to find this NPC or whatever, you can absolutely do that. But it's more meant to be an exploration, poking around. And then it's really an old school play style to have PCs poke around, and as they learn things and discover things, they're going to make their own connections between them and decide what they want to do with them. Is this NPC a neutral, an ally, an enemy based on this one interaction? I don't know. I don't want that hard-coded necessarily in my adventures. I want that to develop organically through play.
well, and kind of piggybacking off of that, the thing that I noticed is you have avoided a lot of the stereotypes of like the classical like D&D Mystic Forest. Was that part of the reason why you had, for instance, not included nymphs, satyrs, elves and such into your forest campaign setting? So because you didn't want the players to assume that, well, okay, they're elves, so they're good.
That's part of it. I mean, so this Lumberlands came out of my Wampus Country campaign, which is sort of a tall tale frontier exploration game that's based more on Americana than it is on European legends. So coming from that angle, I was thinking about how I wanted to do it. And again, we like to write within strictures sometimes. I didn't want to do the same old stuff. Not because I think I'm better than those classic tropes, right? Elves and pixies and treants, and I love all that stuff too. I've run it, I've played it. But why would you, as someone trying to buy my zine, why would you come to me for that when you've seen it 100 times and you're perfectly capable of doing it yourself? I believe that if someone comes to me to read my stuff, it's because they want to see my take on something and they want to see something different, right? So I said from the get-go, I'm not going to use any elves. I didn't even use any demi-humans. I think there's a statement in the front of it that says, look, everybody in here is either human or one of these weird things. If you want dwarves in there, go for it. If you want to turn one of the NPCs into a halfling because that fits your campaign, do that. But it was a lot easier for me to just sort of have those parameters and then just write to that rather than worry about that. I think you could absolutely run Lumberlands slightly reskinned in the Forgotten Realms, right? Drop it into one of the big woods in, I don't know, Cormier or Sembia or something, and tweak the tech a little bit, because there are assumptions in Lumberlands that, you know, maybe we have rifles, but it would still work. It would still work. The larger tonal shift isn't the critters. It's the bad puns, I think.
I don't know. There are quite a few what is it? Bad puns in most D&D products. That's a time-honored tradition.
It is. It's traditional. Absolutely.
Um, but what is it? Kind of touching on what you had said earlier too. The one of the things that I enjoy about like a lot of the older modules, for instance, the X series we had already mentioned, although Master of the Desert Nomads kind of means that you have to have a desert in there. Like it really isn't world specific. Like you can really just kind of pick that up and put it anywhere,
Absolutely.
uh, with any setting that you're playing. And I really feel that like one of the choices that a lot of people do is with a lot of more modern modules, they really want to like hammer in that this is this setting. Like Wizards of the Coast does that. I've seen it in a lot of Pathfinder and Paizo products to where like even if it's not really needed, there's going to be 3 pages that the Grand Duchy from this kingdom is having a convoy over here, and that's why ABC. I see that in a lot of non-OSR products all the time, and I'm wondering, because you had mentioned before about building your personal brand, at what point is that beneficial to you as a OSR creator to basically do that with your products, and at what point do you want to make it more generalized to have a wider audience?
For me, I think keeping it generalized will always be a goal. Um, Not so, people talk about good vanilla being sort of a generic fantasy D&D vibe. Adventures and mini settings that are good vanilla can be dropped into anybody's campaign, right? There's nothing too weird in there that you would have to change. I think I go a step further than that. Butter rum or something. It's an acquired taste, but it's still fairly generic. I don't really get excited about products that demand canonicity from me as a DM. That's the first thing I file off of anything I'm going to cannibalize. And I would expect anybody reading my stuff to do the same thing, right? I mean, I understand why TSR and Wizards put a lot of that kind of detail and structure in their products because that's what their audience clamors for. I'm not sure their audience is the same as my audience or my potential audience. They overlap, but it's not necessarily the same people. I mean, when you look at folks who are really deep into Paizo stuff, Pathfinder lore, they get deep into it. Then the Forgotten Realms people are the same. The Dark Sun people, you don't even have to have novels out for people to get big into, I know this world and I like the consistency of this world. And I want to play in this world and I want to run games in this world. And that's great. I have no problem with that. I've run games in lots of published worlds before. But I think the heart of the hobby has always been, and hopefully will always be, creating and exploring your own worlds. I mean, to me, and this might be the most OSR thing I say today, right? D&D is what happens at my dining room table. It's not what happens at Gen Con, and it's not what happens in Seattle, right? D&D exists at the interface between the players, and including, the DM as one of those players. It's not what's in the rule book. So if you're looking for that spark, that creative spark and that interactive spark, I think we need to continue to focus on things that can be used at the table. There's a lot of lonely fun to be had in reading the novels or creating 30 characters that you'll never play. People are always going to do that. I've done it myself. But the pinnacle creative act of the role-playing hobby is to run that game with your friends and run it a long time.
Picking up with the creative spark, as it were,
Hmm.
uh, our gaming track is doing a module contest this year, and I thought it would be fun to basically do a little brainstorming session to kind of get the creative juices flowing.
Sure.
All right. So what we're looking for is an adventure, basically that you can play with four to six players. That will take them about 2 to 4 hours.
Okay.
Con schedule.
Yep.
Um, what is it? We want the theme of the module to be piety or zealotry, depending on which side of that you fall on.
Well, that's interesting. Okay.
Um, what is it? Have at least one combat, at least one social encounter, and at least one puzzle, trap, or mystery.
The first thing that interests me when you mention those limitations or springboards, depending on how you want to look at them, is the zealotry piety thing. I think in a lot of fantasy fiction and in D&D scenarios, we see a lot of zealotry associated with cultists and evil priests and this sort of stuff. I think we very rarely see actual piety. You know, we have a lot of settings where there are churches or temples and they kind of exist and they're there for healing and maybe sometimes they do political stuff. But I can probably count on one hand in the last, 35 years, the number of PCs I've seen who kind of really role played piety or struggling with their faith in a really evocative way. So I think given the choice between zealotry and piety, I think I'd want to do something about piety, although it might be harder. You want to reach out and do something that's a little different. And it needs to be in a con session. So yeah, stuff that fits in a con session can be difficult. Not only do you have the time stricture, but you have to presume you're going to have less time than you think you're going to have. I think I would do something about, it's got to be immediately recognizable as saying, piety. This is one of the themes, right? Maybe we do something about, I have this image in my mind of a cathedral that has sunk beneath the earth and is now like in a cavern, a huge prehistoric cavern. That could be pretty cool. And so then I think you could, set something so the PCs have to, go down. They're probably experienced delvers, right? Whatever level we're doing this at. They have to hustle down to this cathedral that sunk beneath the ground and do whatever they're doing. Ideally, I would set it up so the cathedral sunk because of, hubris or impiety or something like that generations ago, right? And that sets up your theme that this is what happens when you anger the gods, because you want to set up the payoff of the PCs potentially reversing that situation, right? You want your kind of Elizabethan return to normal by the end of the session, if you can manage it. D&D is hard with win conditions, but if you can get a good win condition, you're doing pretty well there. What were the other strictures? Oh my goodness.
You need at least one combat, one social encounter, and a puzzle, trap, or mystery.
Okay. So, puzzle, trap, or mystery, I think I would do something about, and this would require development, the central mystery being, why did the cathedral sink beneath the earth? And is there a way to raise it again? I haven't seen PCs re-sanctify a ruined temple in a long, long time. Presumably it's something any cleric of a decent level could do, but I don't remember them ever doing it. So that might be interesting as like an extra win condition, right? To kind of restore the church. Puzzle wise though, beyond the central gimmick mystery, when I set up encounters, I try to use the gimmicks that are inherent to the encounter. So if we're talking about, I keep using the word cathedral, so I'm imagining in my mind a proper Gothic cathedral, right? Not a standard fantasy temple. So maybe we would do something with stained glass, right? Are some of the windows still intact and you could do some sort of puzzle with the stained glass images or something? That could be pretty cool. Something like that might engender handouts. Everybody loves handouts, right? Especially for a puzzle. But you'd want to make sure, and this is general advice, every puzzle really only has one solution, but you need to make sure that if it's a puzzle that has to be solved, then they do solve it. If it's a bonus puzzle, like if they don't solve the puzzle, it's okay. They can still complete the adventure. But if they do solve it, they can get to the secret room where the cool stuff is. Then by all means, let them fail. right? um, it's important to have a possibility of real failure. Otherwise, we're just kind of following along with whatever the plot is.
Well, kind of jumping off of that point,
Yeah.
maybe the puzzle is that uh, the positioning of the stained glass windows is in some way allowing the cathedral to float, and something had happened, this impropriety had caused it to fall. So the puzzle itself could be trying to pilot this cathedral.
Oh wow, that'd be pretty cool. You
Uh,
pilot a cathedral from the altar, from the nave? I don't know. That's for
well,
somebody smarter than me to figure out, but that's pretty cool. Flying cathedral would be pretty cool.
well, yeah, and it introduces multiple solutions to the same puzzle. Especially if we're not necessarily trying to get the cathedral back to where it was, then we could do a lot with that, and I think players would have fun like trying to figure out ways to bash a cathedral into enemies.
Oh, of course they would. I mean, anytime you have an interesting location, even if it isn't magically mobile, any PC worth their salt is going to stop for a second and think, "Do we want this to be ours?" Right? I think that's very normal and should be encouraged. Um, I did have PCs that had a flying castle years and years ago, and it was great until it wasn't. But balance issues come up when they can fly around like that. But speaking of flying, so if we stick with this cathedral concept, you got to have gargoyles, right? So maybe that's our combat encounter, or a set piece one. I like the idea of doing something with gargoyles because it's a natural trope to go with the cathedral, but I'd want to mess with them a little bit. I think, we see gargoyles as this kind of low-level flying nuisance monster in D&D, and they're made of stone and this, that, and the other. I think I would probably go with something that I would call a gargoyle, but would actually be some sort of degenerate cryptid type thing, like a Mothman or Batboy type idea. Maybe it's the descendants of the parishioners who were trapped in the cathedral when it sank hundreds of years ago, and they're all pallid and cave blind, and rather than having wings as separate from the arms, maybe their arms have sort of mutated into wings or something. I don't know. That's a very weird Tales way to do it. Like that's a Lovecraft or Hodgson kind of way to do it, maybe.
Oh, I like it. What is it? And that kind of sets us up for a potential social encounter too, which is our last criteria. You could have basically the petitioners may have descended to the point to where they don't understand language, or at least they don't understand your language, but
Mm-hmm.
the original priest descendant who kind of screwed the whole thing up, he probably at least knows like the equivalent of the Latin, because
Oh,
he's
sure. Yeah.
he's still trying to hold services, and
Use a holy tongue or something. Yeah.
yeah, so that may be a way for like him and the either the cleric or the paladin, or maybe even like several members of the party basically to deal with him, and uh, it's a good way to basically highlight specific characters, because not everybody will necessarily know the secondary language.
Sure. Sure. If you wanted to be really mean to the PCs, you could go a step further and say that there are copies of the illustrated holy book or hymnal or whatever down there, and use those photos, or not photos, the illustrations in there to do almost a Dormak and Jalad at Tanagra type. I presume you're familiar, type situation where you have to show the right pictures to the gargoyles, and then they kind of flip pages and show pictures back. That could take a long time at the table, though. I probably wouldn't do that for a con session.
Well, that might also be an interesting puzzle to where like you could actually have like a handout of like prayer books with like 5 images in there, and what is it have like a whole code word system in there. But yeah,
That could be cool. Yeah.
what is it for a 2 to 4 hour session? That's
It
yeah,
depends on pacing can be hard. Yeah, it depends on
yeah,
how quickly they go through other stuff, right? Anytime you have a con session like that, you got to have a spine that's kind of mandatory or assumed, and then little branching bits that you have an idea of how long they might take, and then you can either add them or skip them.
sure. Plus, you'll also have to account for like players that just are like gargoyles, get them.
Right, right, and that's a question. Well, especially in a campaign game, you can have a complete fail state. right? You could have your PCs take the mission or whatever, or decide they want to do it, and they screw it up, and they never get the cathedral out, and they don't put the reliquary in the altar, whatever they're supposed to do. You can fail in a campaign. In a con game, I think the expectation around the table is that you get to some sort of satisfying ending, not necessarily the big win, but some kind of conclusion, you know?
Yeah, even if it's a abysmal failure, that's a bit more satisfying than just, well, okay, I guess you guys leave now.
Right. Yeah. If it was a TPK or an abysmal failure, you could have some box text ready to talk about how horrible things got in the weeks following because you screwed up. That could be pretty satisfying. Yay, we did that.
What is it? Especially with some of the more grim settings, I would say that there are a lot more favorable stories about how, like, you know, oh man, we went into White Plume Mountain and like we tried to ride the crab. We shouldn't have tried to ride the crab.
Well, it's funny because those shared common experiences are important for hobbyists, right? You want to be able to run into people who have played some of the same kinds of adventures or fought the same stuff you have, um, even if it was done in different ways at different tables. That commonality is important, I think.
Oh yeah. What is it? It's really what kind of connects us and like makes it to where, like, some person from Ohio can sit at the table with somebody from California or Seattle, and they just go. There's not really a big long explanation about, like, differences and like what the world expectations are, things like that. You can just sit down and go, and for the most part, that's one of the things that I like about the OSR, because you can, even if they're not official races or things like that, I mean, you can like sit down and say, look, I got this character who's a Bunbarian from this one zine. Let's
Hmm.
do this.
Right, and people who buy into that scene, especially the DMs, are totally okay with that. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that there's no real assumption of balance, right? So if you bring some variant class to the table, I know two things. One, it's probably not more than 15% overpowered. I don't know, maybe we'll see. But the second thing that I know is if we get 2 or 3 sessions in and your character is a problem, we're going to talk about it like adults. And if there's something that needs to get nerfed, we'll nerf it and we'll just keep playing, right? We're not worried about what's official. When did the errata come out? What does the sage say? We're just playing our game together.
It encourages a more one-on-one experience, and I always like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's personal. I mean, despite the 40 years of jokes about nerds in the basement, role playing games are about as social as you can get. There are implicit and explicit social contracts about what we can and can't do at the table. And we're investing hours and hours and hours with either good friends or strangers at a con simulating personal interaction. But you can't simulate personal interaction without having personal interaction. So it's a social game.
Oh yeah, fundamentally you're correct. It looks like time is getting away from us. If some of our viewers wanted to follow you on social media and or your blog, where would they find that?
They can go to Twitter if they can stand it and find me at Daydream Tiger One. That's the imprint name that I use. I also have, I think, a spell book up on drive-through under Daydream Tiger. Or you can go to the blog at wampuscountry.blogspot.com. It's recently come out of hibernation with some new session reports, so I'm hoping to get a lot more new content on there in the coming months.
Well, the hibernation is appropriate given the subject matter. What is it? We had talked about your Lumberlands zine, and although we aren't at the point yet where it is ready for distribution outside of your Kickstarter backers, where would people be able to find that when it is?
Well, so right now you should be able to find it, or by the time this gets posted, at your favorite RPG zine reseller, right? So Exalted Funeral, Spear Witch, Floating Chair, those kinds of places have copies or should have them soon. We'll get print on demand through drive-through at some point, and then of course it'll be available in PDF there as well in perpetuity.
Thank you, sir. You've been a very delightful guest, and I've enjoyed this immensely.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem.